This is the Seth Mila Program.
Have you ever waved at somebody only to realize they weren't waving at you, they were actually waving to the person behind you? You ever push the door that very clearly says pull? Maybe you've sent a text message to the wrong person. We've all had those moments we would love to erase. Some of those moments, they make us laugh, as some make us cringe, and some actually change the direction of our very lives. Today, we are going to talk about failure. Not because failure is actually something to fear. No, actually, some of the greatest people in history and some of God's most faithful servants discovered that failure was not the end of their story. In fact, it became the beginning of something even greater. Something that I have found that I've come to enjoy is kind of investigating these questions that roll around in our head, but we don't really talk much about. Today, one of the questions that I'd really like to explore is failure, and if failure is as bad as we think it is. And, we all know failure can be embarrassing. Failure can be discouraging. Sometimes failure is pretty expensive, and it can be heartbreaking. Sometimes failure leaves us wondering whether or not we'll ever even recover. The truth is, every one of us has failed in one way, shape, form, or fashion. Some of our failures make for some pretty funny stories later on. I have a few. Some I have shared with my family. Some I may never. Anyway, some of these failures still hurt every time we think back on them. That's not uncommon. But what if we have been looking at our failures perhaps from the wrong perspective? What if some of the greatest inventors, artists, leaders, business owners, etc., and even some of the people God used most powerfully all have one thing in common? They failed. And not once, not twice, sometimes spectacularly. And yet somehow their failures did not become the final chapter of their lives. As I dug into this topic, I noticed something. The people we tend to admire the most aren't usually the people who never failed. They're the people who refuse to let failure define them. And I began asking myself kind of another question that goes along with it. What if failure was not the end of our story? It never is, right? What if it's simply the place where a better story begins? So, in the course of our conversation, I'd like to introduce you to a few people who were rejected, people who were told they weren't good enough, people whose ideas didn't work, people who disappointed others, and people who believed that they had made mistakes so bad they could never recover from it. Some of their names you're going to recognize immediately. Others maybe will surprise you. But every one of them has something to teach us. And hopefully by the end of today's program, maybe we will together discover what they discovered. That failure does not have to determine your future. So let's begin, shall we, with a young man that dreamed of drawing cartoons long before anybody knew his name. His name was Walt Disney. And when you hear the name Walt Disney, what immediately comes to mind? For me, I see the image of Walt Disney World gates. I've been there so many times, I could probably walk through there blindfolded. In high school marching band, in junior high marching band, with friends. In fact, I can't even tell you how many times I've been there. So that's what comes to my mind. But maybe for you, it's Mickey Mouse or Cinderella's Castle. Maybe it's Disney Vacations and the fireworks. Anyway, most of us recognize this entertainment company. It's all over the world. So it could be fairly easy to assume that success was almost inevitable for Walt Disney, but it was not. Long before Walt Disney became one of the world's most admired storytellers, he was simply a young man with a dream and some pencils. Like many people starting out, he believed hard work and talent would be enough. Life, however, had other plans. Early in his career, Disney worked for a newspaper in Kansas City. His employment there did not last very long. According to one of the stories most often told about his early career, he was actually let go because his editor believed, you ready for this? He lacked imagination and didn't have any good ideas. Remember, we're talking about Walt Disney. Now, whether those exact words were spoken, it's been debated over the years. What isn't debated is that Disney's early career was filled with disappointment. His very first animation company, Laugh-O-Gram Studios, showed some real promise. The cartoons were very creative. People tended to enjoy them, had good comments about it. But creativity alone actually wasn't enough to pay the bills. The company eventually went bankrupt. Imagine for a moment what that must have felt like to Disney. You know, you're chasing your dream. You've poured everything you have into it. You believe in it with all your heart, and then it fails. And for a lot of people, that's where the story would end. Dream over, move on. Find something safer, something more predictable. But Walt Disney saw something different, obviously. He didn't see failure as proof that he was not talented. He saw failure as, well, part of learning how to succeed. So he packed what little he had, boarded a train, and headed to California. There, he and his brother, Roy Disney, started all over. There was one more disappointment, however, waiting for them. Disney traveled to New York, hoping to negotiate a contract with his distributor and secure the future of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. This is the new character that he had developed. And instead, he learned that not only was he losing the character, but many of his own animators had already agreed to stay with the distributor. So what that means is he left the meeting. The future that he was counting on, basically, for Laugh-O-Gram Studios, gone. As he boarded the train for the long trip back to California, he could have spent the journey wondering if his dream had finally come to an end. Instead, he began sketching ideas for a brand new character, a cheerful little mouse. The mouse became Mickey, and the rest, as they say, is history. Today, billions of people around the world recognize Mickey Mouse. Does anybody remember Laugh-O-Gram Studios? Probably not. Do you remember Oswald, the other character? No. Fewer still remember the bankrupt young animator wondering whether his dream had come to an end. History remembers Walt Disney's success. But success wasn't what built his character. It was failure. Failure taught him resilience. It taught him perseverance. It taught him begin again. And perhaps that's the first lesson failure has for all of us. Failure doesn't always mean you're on the wrong path. Sometimes it simply means that, well, you're being prepared for a better path. Now, next, I want to talk to you about a product that I'm pretty sure you have somewhere in your house. Every time I think about it, I'm transported back to my childhood. I'm talking about WD-40. I can picture right now in my head, very clear, standing in this old dilapidated garage that we had at the house. And my dad was standing at his workbench, let's be honest, cussing over something he was working on. And of course, my job was to help, but help actually meant I just stood there and waited and then asked, "Can I go back inside?" To which the answer was no. Hand me that, whatever. Well, a lot of the times, one of the things he would reach for was that blue and yellow can of WD-40, and it had the little red straw sticking out so that you could spray the stuff right where it needed to be. I can smell it right now. I can tell you I can smell it. That's how familiar we are almost all associated with WD-40, right? And it's funny how a simple smell like that can unlock memories from years ago. Anyway, it's WD-40. But why is it called WD-40? Why not WD-1 or WD-7 or just WD, right? And by the way, I've learned that it can't be pronounced WD, it's WD. I may have mispronounced it earlier. WD-40. It turns out that it's a pretty interesting story. Back in the 1950s, a small company in San Diego was trying to solve a very specific problem. The aerospace industry needed a product that would displace water and help prevent corrosion on the outer skin of the rockets and missiles that they were working on. Now, that sounded simple enough, but it was not. The first formula did not work. Neither did the second, or the third, or the 10th, or the 25th. But, the people working on it, by this point, you would think they were thinking to themselves, man, we're wasting our time. This is not going to work. Maybe the idea is not possible. Maybe, you know what, maybe somebody else is going to do this. Let's go have lunch. But they did not. They didn't have that attitude. They kept experimenting. They kept adjusting. They kept learning. And finally, on the, 40th attempt, they found it. That's the formula that worked. And they named it exactly what it was, Water Displacement Formula 40, WD-40. Now, think about that. Millions of people recognize those two letters and the two numbers. Their garages, workshops, farms, factories, all over the place, toolboxes, all over the world. And what most people don't recognize are the 39 attempts that came first. Those early formulas are usually called failures. But were they? Every unsuccessful attempt taught those engineers, those scientists, those that were working on it, it taught them something. Each one eliminated another possibility. Each one brought them a little closer to the answer. Without Formula One, and I'm not talking about the racing team, that's a whole nother conversation that I could get into. No, but without that first failed, quote unquote, failed formula, there never would have been Formula 40. You think life kind of works that same way? And sometimes we become discouraged because, something didn't work out. We assume we've failed. I do. That's my default setting. If it doesn't work out, if there's a snag or a wrinkle or somebody is unhappy, boom, I immediately think I have failed. But perhaps we've simply learned one more way that doesn't accomplish what we're trying to do. And that's not wasted effort. That's actually progress. Thomas Edison once expressed a similar thought when speaking about his work developing the light bulb. He essentially said that he hadn't failed thousands of times. Yes, thousands. He said he simply had discovered thousands of ways it didn't work. Kind of a lot of wisdom in that perspective. Failure has a way of teaching lessons that success rarely does. It teaches patience and persistence and humility. And, sometimes it teaches us that the breakthrough that we're hoping for may be just one more attempt away. So the next time you see a can of WD-40 sitting on a shelf, just remember you're not looking at one successful formula. You're looking at 40 attempts, the 39 reasons someone could have quit, and thankfully, they didn't. So let me ask you a personal question about the things that you have worked on or attempted. Have you ever worked on something, just really put everything into it, something you were genuinely proud of, only to have somebody else look at it and go, yeah, no thanks. Maybe it was a project, a job application, an audition, a business idea. Maybe it was something much more personal. Rejection has a way of making us question more than our work. Sometimes it makes us question ourselves. Personally, I hate rejection. Raise your hand if you love it. No? Anyone? No? Okay, good. Few of us understand that feeling better than a man named Theodore Seuss Geisel. We all know him by Dr. Seuss. Today, his books have, sold hundreds of millions of copies. Generations of children have learned to read through his stories like, The Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Personally, I think my parents read the Green Eggs and Ham to me so much that, well, they were probably sick of it. It's difficult to imagine a childhood without Dr. Seuss. But there was a time when almost nobody wanted to publish him. His first children's book, titled "And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street," was rejected, and not just a few times. 27 publishers turned it down. 27! Imagine you're carrying your manuscript from one publisher to another, hoping, man, this time you're going to see what I've done and you're going to like it, only to hear no. Again and again. So you can imagine after the 27th rejection, Dr. Seuss had reached his limit. He later admitted that he was walking down Madison Avenue planning to burn the manuscript and just give up writing children's books altogether. Right? Think about that. One decision, one very discouraging afternoon after 27th rejection, and the world may never have known Dr. Seuss. But as you can imagine, something rather unexpected happened. On that walk down Madison Avenue, he happened to run into an old college friend who had recently become an editor at a publishing company. His friend said, "Hey, what are you carrying?" Dr. Seuss explained. The editor asked to see the manuscript, and there's some debate, but, after 27 rejections, Seuss was pretty much reluctant to hand it over. It's like, really? 27 strangers have just told me no. Now somebody I know, a friend of mine, I'm going to let him have a chance at saying no? But he did. He gave him the manuscript, and a short time later, it was accepted for publication. And it's tempting to hear that story and conclude, well, he just got lucky, or, see, it's not what you know, it's who you know. But actually, I think the lesson is that the manuscript that publisher number 28 accepted was the same manuscript that 27 others had rejected. You see, the value of the work had not changed. It was the opinion of the person holding it that changed. That's an important distinction, I think. Sometimes we allow someone else's opinion to become our identity. One person says, "You're never going to make it." And another one says, "You're not talented." Another says, "You know what? Nobody wants what you're offering." And if we're not careful, we actually begin believing those voices. Those voices start to become the voice in our own head. And Dr. Seuss could have. But instead, he just kept walking. And because he did, millions of children now grow up laughing and imagining and learning to love books. I think there may be another lesson kind of hiding inside this. Sometimes rejection isn't God's way of saying no. Sometimes it's simply his way of saying, not here, not right now. One publisher wasn't the right publisher. 27 weren't the right publishers, but 28, number 28, yep, that was the right one. That's true in life more often than we realize. Not every closed door means you've taken the wrong path. Sometimes it just simply means you haven't reached the right door yet. Perhaps a thought that was running through Dr. Seuss's mind as he was getting ready to hand over that manuscript for the 28th time to somebody he knew is, I don't want to disappoint you. I don't. Have you ever disappointed someone? Maybe someone whose opinion really mattered to you. Maybe it was one of your parents. Maybe it was a friend, a spouse, a mentor. Maybe it was just somebody you admired. You wish you could go back, explain yourself, do things a lot differently. But you can't. Nobody has the Wayback Machine. I really wish sometimes I could go back and fix some of the oopsies that I've made, but we can't. You can't go back. You can't explain yourself. You can't go and do things differently. Some mistakes, let's be honest, leave scars. Sometimes they damage relationships. And if you've ever wondered whether trust can really, truly be rebuilt, I'd like to tell you about a man named Mark. Some places in the Bible refer to Mark as John Mark, but most of us simply know him as Mark, the man God would later use to write one of the four Gospels. Guess which one? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yeah, Mark. That's the one. And this is what makes his story so remarkable. Because before God entrusted him to write a gospel, Mark experienced a failure that could easily have defined the rest of his life. You see, Mark was given a really great opportunity, an incredible opportunity. He was invited to travel with two of the most respected Christian leaders of the first century, Paul and Barnabas. Now, if someone invited you to join a mission led by Paul and Barnabas, you'd probably think, man, as a Christian, it doesn't get any better than this. But somewhere along the journey, something happened. Now, the Bible doesn't go into detail and really tell us exactly what happened. Maybe the work became harder than Mark expected. Maybe he became discouraged. Maybe he just became homesick. We don't really know. And I think that's intentional. Matter of fact, I know it is. Nothing in Scripture is, oopsie, accidental. It's all intentional. Anyway, because whatever the reason was, Mark left. He went home before the work was finished. Well, the work wasn't finished from Paul's perspective, and that was seriously disappointing to Paul. Sometime later, Paul and Barnabas began planning another mission journey. Barnabas, of course, said, hey, let's bring Mark along. And Paul said, yeah, about that, no. In fact, that situation became a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. Their disagreement became so sharp that the two men decided to go in separate directions. So imagine Mark's perspective. He knew that the two men he respected the most could not have come to an agreement because of something he had done. Now, if that's where the story ended, it would be heartbreaking. And thankfully, that is not where it ended. You see, years later, Paul wrote his final letter. Near the end of it, he made a simple request to Timothy. He said, get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry. Helpful. Isn't that an awesome descriptor? Paul didn't say, I've forgiven him. He didn't say, I can tolerate him now. He said, he is helpful to me. So somewhere between leaving that first missionary journey and Paul's final years, Mark rebuilt the trust he had once lost. The Bible, again, doesn't tell us exactly how. Maybe it happened one faithful day at a time, one act of obedience after another, one opportunity after another, one step at a time. Either way, it happened. And maybe that's what you need to hear today. Perhaps you're not wondering whether God can forgive you. Maybe you're wondering, will anyone ever trust me again? Mark's story says yes. Trust can be rebuilt, and it is a long journey sometimes, most times. Trust can be rebuilt, but not quickly. It's not easy, but it can be done when done faithfully. Yeah, like I said earlier, failure may leave a scar, but it doesn't have to become your identity. It's just one of the reasons why I love Mark's story. His greatest contribution wasn't that he never stumbled. It was that he refused to stay where he stumbled. He kept growing. He kept serving. He kept following God. And in time, the man who had once been left behind became the man Paul specifically asked to have beside him. That is redemption. Before we move on and I start talking about the next subject of our topic, failure, I thought maybe I ought to share something from my own personal experience. I hate the idea of failing. I hesitate to say that I have a fear of failure, but It actually may be what it is. I mean, here's what I've always had kind of running through my head was, what if I put everything that I am into something, right? A writing project or a radio program or whatever, I put everything that I am into it and it fails. Well, this is something that I've learned. What I'm sharing here and through this whole conversation is that a failure, a turnout that isn't exactly what you hope for, that's not the end of it, right? That's not the end of the story. There is more to come. I only really came to understand that when I began to really fully trust God, and knowing that God knows my future, God knows my history, but He also knows what's going to happen next, and I can trust Him. So here, let me give you a couple examples. One example. So when I was in Wisconsin, I had a political talk radio program, and it was the demographic. I know you don't really care about demographics probably, but the demographic was for men somewhere between 40 and 60 years old that were educated and in a good job, and you know what I'm talking about. That was who the show was geared to. And over time, the few years that I was there, the show built momentum. It built a following. It grew in the ratings, and it was actually a very, very successful radio program. And I was kind of riding that wave of success. And one day at a live appearance, a woman came up to me and said, I'll be honest with you, I don't like your show. I really don't like you. And that stung. And I mean, it stung deeply to the point where for a while I was wondering, well, is the success that I've had over the years, is it real, or is this a shell? Is this a house of cards? I mean, Am I thinking that I'm very successful and that people like me, and actually I'm terrible and nobody likes me? Does that sound familiar? I didn't get a resolution to this issue for a while. Now, I got over that situation. I put it behind me. I didn't understand it for what it was, but I just ignored it. I moved on. Doggone it, there's enough people out there that like my show. I'm good enough. I'm smart enough. People like me. I'm going to keep going. And so I did. Well, then a while later, a few years later, I had the opportunity to move to Virginia. And here's the main reason. Have you ever been to Wisconsin? Have you spent winter in Wisconsin? For a boy that grew up in Florida, moving to Wisconsin, that may have been my greatest failure. It wasn't, of course, but those harsh winters, it didn't take me long before I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. So I started looking for a warmer climate. So eventually we moved to Virginia. And while I was in Virginia, I had the opportunity to do a show, another morning show, only this show was more geared toward women. It was geared toward women, 20s to late 40s. And again, after some time of working with a new partner and figuring out, new strategies and so forth, that show began to have some success. And we had a lot of people that wrote us and told us they really liked the show. There were two things that happened that made me feel like a failure. One, I had a guy come up to me and go, I don't get your show. I don't understand it. This makes sense. I don't like it. I don't like the show at all. It doesn't seem to have any substance. And it gutted me. I remembered what the woman said to me when I was in Wisconsin. I'm like, here we go again. Now this is twice that somebody's come up and has criticized something that I am pouring everything I am into, and they say, I don't like it. Made me feel like a failure. Now, I mentioned who the show was directed at for a very specific reason. And I now go to the second thing that happened while in Virginia that made me feel like a failure. while I was in Wisconsin, I was the star of the show. Everybody loved me. It was all about me. And you can imagine my ego got pretty big. Well, when I'm in Virginia, I said, again, this show is geared toward women. And my co-host, guess what, was a woman. And everybody loved her. Now, the way the show was billed and the way it was marketed and the way it was told to me is, I'm going to be the lead. I'm the guy. My co-host is just that, the co-host. You know, the side dish to the main course. Well, the reality was I was barely on the plate. Every time we would go to a live gig, every time we would be out, women would come to my co-host, hug her, tell her how great she was, how much they loved her, and quite often they would step around me to get to her. And I was like, really? I began to feel like a failure. I don't remember exactly what happened, how it happened, to adjust my perspective on what I was perceiving as failure. But it was simply this. When I was in Wisconsin, the show was geared to men, and it was a woman that didn't like the show. The honest situation is that was a sign of success. If the show is geared to men and the woman didn't like it, well, then the show's targeting audience was working. In Virginia, this is exactly the opposite. The guy that told me he didn't like the show, well, the show wasn't geared toward him. The show was geared toward the women, and the women loved the show. And that was all about my co-host. The women were relating to the woman on the show. They liked me. I had nobody else, I don't think, other than the guy, ever came up and said, ugh, you're terrible. But it was very clear they loved her. I was also there. It was that realization that it's like, look, this is not personal, and I'm not failing. It's just a difference of perspective. And once I realized that, it was like, wow, it helped me to get over it, helped me to deal with it, helped me to understand what I was perceiving as failure was just a misconception, a bad perception. I just didn't see the trees for the forest or the forest for the trees. However you say it, I just failed at making that analogy. Okay, let's move on, shall we? Enough of that. Have you ever looked back on your own life and wondered, did I miss my chance? Maybe you imagined that your life would, look different by now. Maybe you've made decisions that you wish you could change. Maybe you simply felt like your best opportunities have already passed you by. If you've ever felt that way, I have. I want to introduce you to someone who probably understood that feeling better than most. His name was Harland Sanders. You probably know him as Colonel Sanders today. His face is everywhere, right? All over the sign of the KFC restaurants and in those weird, remember the commercials with the various forms of Colonel Sanders? The one that I'm thinking of right now that sticks out in my head is the professional wrestler, Colonel Sanders. I'll be honest with you, they were entertaining commercials. I remember the food product, but I could not tell you right now why. Wait a minute. Why do I remember them? And was it ineffective? Because I remember it, and I'm thinking of KFC chicken right now. There it is. Oh, okay. Anyway, his face everywhere. Success came to him much later than most people realize. Long before we knew him as Colonel Sanders, his life was anything but predictable. His father died when he was just a little boy. With his mother working to support the family, he learned to cook at a very young age, and not because he dreamed of becoming a chef, but because someone had to prepare the meals. Looking back, it's kind of amazing to think that God was preparing him decades before he ever even realized it. As he grew older, he worked wherever he could. He was a farmhand, a streetcar conductor, a railroad fireman, an insurance salesman. Hey, don't hold that against him. A tire salesman. And apparently somewhere in there, he even practiced law for a time. I mean, can you do that without it? Anyway, that's another story. Some jobs ended because of circumstances way beyond his control. Others simply just weren't the right fit. And I can imagine if you had known Harlan back in the day, you probably wouldn't have described him as successful. He was a man still searching for where he belonged. Then something kind of unexpected happened. While he was operating a service station in Corbin, Kentucky, he noticed that the weary travelers, they needed something more than gas. They needed a really good meal. So he began cooking for them. And at first, it wasn't really a restaurant. It was just kind of some home-cooked meals served from a small little dining area connected to the service station. But the locals started coming back. Word spread. People would drive a little ways to come to his quote-unquote gas station/restaurant. Before long, that little dining room grew into a full-blown restaurant, and it was there, after years of experimenting, that he started to perfect that pressure-fried chicken recipe that would eventually make him famous. And for a while, things were going great. And then everything changed. A new interstate highway was built. That meant traffic was no longer going by his little gas station, his little restaurant. Customers disappeared. And the business collapsed. The restaurant closed. And so after spending a lifetime of working, after finally building something that he was proud of, poof, gone. Most of us probably would have called that the end. He did not. At 65 years of age, when many people, think about retirement, he believed he still had something worth offering. So he packed up his pressure cooker, his seasoning recipe, and started driving from restaurant to restaurant. Apparently, he would cook chicken for restaurant owners and propose a kind of a partnership. He said, if you like it, then you pay me a small royalty for every piece of fried chicken that you've sold. And a lot of them said, yeah, we're not doing that either. A lot of places said no, again and again and again. The exact number is kind of debated, but it's pretty much accepted that he heard no hundreds of times before finding some pathway to success. You imagine that? Hundreds of times. Just a little bit ago, I told you that I got upset and felt like a failure because I got one kind of sort of rejection, not hundreds. He kept going, kept knocking on doors, kept believing. He kept trying. And eventually somebody said, yeah, you know what? Sounds good. Your chicken's pretty good. Let's see what happens. Let's give it a try. So what started as one man's determination eventually became one of the most recognizable restaurant brands in the world. And one of the things that I just really appreciate about Harlan Sanders' story, it reminds me that God doesn't measure our usefulness by our age. God doesn't measure our usefulness by how many jobs we've had or how many times we've had to begin over. Sometimes the chapter that you think is the ending is simply the chapter God uses to prepare you for what is coming next. Maybe that's where you are today. Maybe you're looking back at some opportunities that you thought you missed, or wondering whether, hey, are my best years already behind me? Let me offer you encouragement, if I may. As long as God has given you today, He still has a purpose for you for tomorrow. Your story isn't over because the calendar has a certain designation. And it certainly isn't over because you've experienced disappointment. Sometimes the greatest work of your life begins after everyone else thinks you're finished. I have one final story that I'd like to share with you, but before we start that, I want to ask you a question. What is the biggest mistake you have ever made? And I'm not talking about the embarrassing one that kind of makes you laugh. I'm talking about the one that still hurts, the one that you wish you could erase. I'm sorry if that brings up some uncomfortable memories, but I have a purpose. If you have one of those, and most of us do, then you already have something in common with Peter. Peter loved Jesus. There was never any question about that. He believed in Jesus. He followed Jesus. He left everything to become one of his disciples. When Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter boldly answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." But then everything changed. On the night that Jesus was arrested, Peter made a promise. "Even if everyone falls away, I never will." Jesus looked at him with compassion and told him something Peter could not believe. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter couldn't imagine that. He was like, no way. He was certain Jesus was wrong. The man that he knew as the Son of God, he's thinking, you're wrong? Okay. Yet, only a few hours later, standing around a fire, Peter was recognized. Someone said to him, "You were with him." Peter denied it. And then he denied it a second time. And then he denied it again, a third time. And just as Jesus had said, the rooster crowed. Luke tells us something that has always captured my attention here. At that very moment, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. I'm imagining that. Jesus looked at him, not in anger, not in condemnation, just a look. Peter immediately remembered what Jesus had said, and he left and wept bitterly. Now, if the story had ended there, it would be one of the saddest moments in Scripture. A man who sincerely loved Jesus, believing he had failed beyond repair. Now, thankfully, that is not where the story ends. You see, after Jesus rose from the dead, Peter was not preaching. He wasn't leading anyone. He really wasn't making any bold declarations. He basically just went back to what he knew, and that is fishing. Maybe he thought that chapter of his life was over. Maybe he believed that God would just, use somebody else. Maybe he thought that his failure had permanently disqualified him. And then, one morning, after a long night of catching no fish, someone was seen standing on the shore. It was Jesus. And do you know what Jesus did? He made breakfast. Yeah, breakfast. John 21, 1 through 14, I believe, puts it this way. It says, "Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. 'I'm going out to fish,' Simon Peter told them, and they said, 'We'll go with you.' So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, 'Friends, haven't you any fish?' 'No,' they answered. He said, 'Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some.' When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, 'It is the Lord,' he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." I love that. Of all the ways Jesus could have confronted Peter, he started with breakfast. No lecture, no embarrassment, no public humiliation, just an invitation to come and eat. After breakfast, Jesus asked Peter one very simple question. "Do you love me?" 3 times he asked. Now, not because Jesus needed the answer, right? Peter did. Each question became another opportunity not to relive his failure, but to actually reaffirm his love. And each time Peter answered, Jesus responded with a new assignment. Feed my sheep. Take care of my sheep. You see what Jesus is doing there? He wasn't reminding Peter of his failure. He was reminding Peter of his future. The denial hadn't changed God's calling. Peter's worst moment didn't become the final chapter of his life. In fact, only a few weeks later, God used that same Peter to boldly proclaim the gospel at Pentecost, where thousands of people came to faith in Christ. The man who once denied even knowing Jesus was now proclaiming him without fear. You know, I don't know what failure you might be carrying with you on your shoulders, in your heart right now. Maybe it's something no one else knows about. Maybe it's something you think about far more than anyone realizes. But I do know this. Jesus was not finished with Peter. He is not finished with you. And you may still remember your greatest failure. I do mine. God remembers his greatest purpose for your life. And those are 2 very different things. You may not be where you hoped you would be, but you are not where you are going to be either. Because failure is never the end of your story when you let God be the author.
And now it's time for
5 random
facts.
If you've ever been in a social setting and have experienced that uncomfortable, awkward silence when the conversation stalls, I offer to you now these 5 random facts to help you be the hero in that circumstance. Keeping with our topic today of failure, bubble wrap. Bubble wrap actually wasn't invented to protect packages. It was originally created in 1957 as textured wallpaper. When that idea failed, the inventors discovered it made excellent protective packaging instead. The Post-it note exists because of weak glue. The adhesive used on Post-it notes was originally considered a failure because it wasn't sticky enough. Years later, another scientist realized that failed glue was perfect for removable notes. And before becoming president, Abraham Lincoln lost more races for the Illinois legislature, Congress, the U.S. Senate, and vice presidents. He lost more elections than he won. His greatest success came years after a lot of public disappointment. And when the Cullinan diamond was discovered in South Africa in 1905, it was so large. How large was it? Thank you. It was so large that some workers initially believed it couldn't possibly be a diamond. It just had to be an interesting rock. Today it is the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found. And lastly, the first fax machine actually predates the telephone. The very first successful fax machine was patented in the 1840s. That means people could theoretically send documents over the wires before they could even make a phone call.
This has been today's edition of
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Random.
Facts.
So before we end our conversation, I'd like to leave you with a final thought. When we started the conversation, kind of set out to investigate failure, right? What we discovered, I think, is something quite different. Failure is not the end. Failure wasn't the end of Walt Disney's story, not the end of Dr. Seuss's story or Mark's story or Colonel Sanders' story. It's not the end of Peter's story, right? Why? Because none of those individuals allowed failure to become the author of their lives. And maybe that's exactly what you need to hear today. Perhaps you've been measuring your life by your worst decision, your greatest regret, or the loudest voice that's ever told you you'll never amount to anything. If I could encourage you at this moment, just measure your life differently. Measure it by the faithfulness of God, because His faithfulness has never depended on your perfection. The same Jesus who restored Peter is still restoring lives today. And He isn't looking for perfect people. Oh, I am so thankful for that. He's looking for willing hearts. Don't let yesterday decide what tomorrow can become. Turn the page. Trust the author and keep walking. Failure is never the end of your story when you let God be the author. Thank you for spending some time with me. I appreciate your time so very much, and I look forward to the next time that we can get together. If you have questions or comments regarding today's show, or perhaps you'd like to suggest a topic for us to explore in a future program, please email me at sethmilamedia@gmail.com. That's sethmilamedia@gmail.com. This program was sponsored in part by Audio Imaging Solutions, LLC. Your message professionally crafted and delivered. For professional voice work, go to audioimigingsolutions.com. That's audioimigingsolutions.com.